Gracias a todos por estar aquí en esta fría mañana. Yo sé que a todos les debe haber costado salir de sus casas, está muy helado. Así que primero que todo agradecerle a todos porque estén acá, porque hayamos llenado este auditorio. En segundo lugar, quisiera agradecer mucho a la Vicerrectoría Académica de la Universidad U.Finis Terrae por el apoyo que brindaron a esta actividad. Realmente no hubiese sido posible hacerla en estas condiciones sin ellos. Así que primero que todo, muchas gracias. En segundo lugar, también agradecer y saludar a nuestro decano, Gonzalo, que está acá con nosotros, que también nos ayuda mucho y también fue muy importante para la realización de esta actividad. Saludar a la gente de la Escuela de Historia, de la Escuela de Literatura también que nos acompañan hoy día, a los estudiantes que vinieron, que me alegra mucho que haya hartos estudiantes hoy día. Yo a nombre también no solo de la escuela, sino de la editorial Tesis 12, que es la que editamos el libro que se está vendiendo allá afuera, que es una serie de trabajos cortos, textos teóricos, metodológicos, inéditos del profesor Rediker. Y a nombre del editorial también quiero agradecer que hayan venido y quiero también agradecer al profesor porque nos haya venido para acá, hasta un lugar al sur del sur como Chile, por su generosidad. Y eso, sin más preámbulos, sin mucho más que demorar, los voy a dejar ahora con el profesor, quien va a hacer una conferencia que se llama Freedomship. Es sobre, digamos, la otra parte o la contraparte de uno de sus libros más conocidos, que es The Slave Ship, El barco esclavo, que está traducido al español por Captain Swing. Este libro trata más bien, y que bueno, va a aparecer a fines de este año, el próximo año, tengo entendido, trata sobre la fuga de esclavos por mar y la solidaridad entre marinerías, el proletariado del Atlántico, del Pacífico y su asistencia a las fugas de esclavos en el Estados Unidos colonial y de antes de la Guerra de Secesión. Así que espero que todo salga bien, que les entretenga, que les guste y nuevamente les agradezco que estén acá. So Marcus, we are glad to get here with us, so thank you very much to come to Chile and to come to our university. So the stage is yours.
Okay. Greetings, everyone. Good morning. Buenos dias. It is my very great pleasure to be here with you at this university. Thanks to the invitation of my friend Luis. And the special pleasure to talk with you about a new book that I'm just now finishing. But it's not so finished that if you find something wrong with it, you can tell me and I can still fix it. So this is a book that was about escaping slavery by sea in North America in the early 19th century. And like Lasso scholarship, this book has a very strange origin. 30 years ago, before most of you were born, I was doing research on another book called The Many-Headed Hydra, and I started studying newspapers in which enslavers placed advertisements for those who had run away. And I saw something in those advertisements that really struck my eye because I am a maritime historian. In advertisement after advertisement, it said, captains of vessels and warned not to take this runaway on board. And this is repeated endlessly. And so I thought, a lot of people are escaping by sea. So I went to read the scholarship on this subject. There's a very, very big body of scholarship on what we call the Underground Railroad. This is how people escaped from the south to the north. Underground Railroad. It turns out this rich scholarship said almost nothing about people who escaped by sea. So this kind of poses an interesting question in the sociology of knowledge, which I hope to address in this lecture. How did these people remain invisible to historians? So 25 years later, after I had written several other books, I came back to this idea and I started working intensively. And I thought at first maybe the reason why no one has studied this subject is because there aren't any sources. Not true. There are lots of sources. You just have to know where to look for them. So what I discovered was that this Underground Railroad, so-called Underground Railroad, might better be called an overseas freeway. Now, I'm really not sure how that's going to be translated. A highway over the sea to freedom. So what then I began to do was to study how this worked. How did it work? Well, one of the first things that we need to know is that it is linked to ships and to sailors and to dock workers and to market women, all of these people who worked on the waterfront. I don't need to tell you about the waterfront because Chile has got the longest coastline in the world, right? I was just in Valparaiso. The waterfront became a battleground in the struggle against slavery. But nobody had really studied this before. So this one thing I want to do with this book is to reveal a new, or shall I say, a lost social world, a world of cooperation among fugitives and sailors and waterfront workers that had been lost to us. Now, I should also say that this book is a sequel to a book that Luis just mentioned, and that is a book called The Slave Ship, A Human History. Someone brought a copy because I signed it. Can you hold it up? Show and tell. Okay, there it is. Now that is a book about the horror of the Middle Passage as people were taken from West Africa to the plantations of the Americas. Extreme violence, terrorism, mass death. But what's really fascinating to me is that despite that experience, the descendants of those people who sailed on the slave ships now turned deep sea sailing ships into instruments of freedom. Coming full circle, from the sea as a place of oppression to the sea as a place of freedom. Okay, so I want to talk to you about how I came to understand this lost social world. And I also want to illustrate to you how this system of maritime escape actually worked. How did it work? And then we'll come at the end back to this issue of why it was invisible for so long. Okay? Okay, so historians always say, context is everything. So I want to give you two important contexts for understanding this system of maritime escape. The first is a global and Atlantic context. And what I'm talking about here is the rise of capitalism. The movement of capitalism in creating the world market, which is done through ships, by the way, and sailors. In 1830, there are 2 million enslaved people in the United States. By 1860, that number has doubled. There are now 4 million people slaving away on plantations, producing tobacco, rice, and most importantly, cotton. And the reason why cotton is so important is because this is the most important part of the Industrial Revolution. Cotton is used to make textiles. Textiles is the leading edge of capitalist production. Textile factories. Now, for a long time, we were taught that slavery and capitalism had nothing to do with each other. Adam Smith said this in the 18th century. He thought slavery was an impediment to capitalism. Economic historians peddled the same story. But as it happens, folks, it's not true. Slavery is absolutely central to the rise of capitalism. The amount of wealth that the slave system produced boggles the mind. It's incredible. As C.L.R. James said, it was the greatest planned accumulation of wealth the world had ever seen up to that point. The planters, the plantation owners, became the most fabulously wealthy people in the world, all based on the blood, sweat, and tears of millions of Africans. Okay, so this is an important part of the context. So if we can have the first slide. This, folks, is a deep sea sailing ship. This particular one is from Liverpool. And this is the most important machine in early capitalism. We talk about the steam engine. The ship is much more important. It's a technology. And this is how Western European maritime states and empires connected the world. It's how they created the world market. Okay? It's an instrument of empire. This one actually happens to be a slave ship. You probably couldn't tell because all these tall ships look similar. But if you look closely, just above the waterline, you see these black squares? Those are airports carved into the side of the ship so that the human cargo inside can breathe. If you have any other cargo in there that isn't alive, you don't cut holes in the side of the ship. It's actually very dangerous to do, but it was necessary to the commerce. So this very ship is crucial to the rise of capitalism. It's crucial to the slave trade, but it's also going to become a key to freedom. And if we could have the next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to stand up and talk about this one a little bit. I think it's the one on the right. Okay, this is a graphic illustration of ship voyages out of world shipping voyages, mostly based in North America in the early 19th century. And so every line represents a single voyage. And look at all of these lines over here along the Chilean coast. Those are mostly whale ships. But what I want to call your attention to here is up there, you see North America, and you see that dark, thick, black smudge representing thousands and thousands of voyages. Almost all of these voyages were coming from northern ports in the United States, like Philadelphia or New York or Boston. And they're going down the coast to southern ports like Baltimore, Norfolk, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia. And they're picking up cotton, tobacco, and then they're bringing them back to the northern ports. Here's what I want you to understand. Every one of those lines represents a potential avenue of escape. Every one of those ships is a place where a sailor can invite a fugitive on board and say,
I can take you to a free country. And the fugitives actually knew quite a bit about this. Many of them knew that slavery had been abolished in the northern states. So they're eager to get on board. Okay, so here's my point about this. One thing that historians frequently talk about is the relationship between structure, frequently economic structures, and agency, meaning the ability of people to change the course of history. So what's really fascinating to me about this is that the structure of trade is also the structure of escape. Those two things go together. Okay, so I'll just continue to use this. My story begins in 1829, 1830, and if we could have the next slide, please. When a man named David Walker, an African-American man who was a man of the waterfront, he lived in Boston, and he wrote a revolutionary tract, a message called David Walker's Appeal. And this is an appeal to all of the enslaved persons throughout the Americas, no matter where you are. And what he said is that you must all follow the example of the recent revolution in Haiti, which defeated the French, the Spanish, and the British navies, and declared its own independence in 1804. And David Walker says, you must rise up and take your freedom. Seize your freedom. Now, this is a very radical thing to say. But what is even more radical about it was David Walker's ways of circulating his ideas. He worked on the waterfront selling clothing to sailors. He was called a slop seller, a clothing seller, a little shop on the waterfront. So here's what he would do. This is brilliant. He would take these sailors' clothes and create secret compartments where he could put the books, the pamphlets, and then sew it back up. And then when that sailor gets to Charleston, South Carolina, he goes ashore and he gives out these pamphlets to the enslaved people. Now, many of them can't read, but some always could. And the idea was that the ones who were literate would read the story aloud to the ones who could not read. Okay? Now, when this very book began to show up in the southern port cities, the southern ruling class lost its mind. They were furious. They were outraged. Here is a free black person in the North trying to encourage uprisings in the South. So they did something very interesting. One of the things they did was to pass legislation that made it impossible for black sailors to come into the port. These were called the Negro Seaman Acts. So when a ship coming from the north that had a black sailor on board came into port, they'd have to put that black sailor in jail until it was time to leave. Then he could come back on board the ship. This was to prevent him from circulating this kind of seditious material. Now, oops, sorry, that's okay. Here we have a depiction of sailors on the lower deck. And you'll see in the far left there is a racist caricature of a black sailor. Don't pay any attention to that, but notice that it's just about right. 1 out of every 6 sailors was black at this time. So there were a lot of them, and there were a lot of protests about the way in which they were being denied their rights as American citizens every time they came into a southern port, because they were free. Many of them had been enslaved, but they had gained their freedom in one way or another. Okay, so So basically, David Walker and this radical pamphlet inaugurates a whole decade of resistance. The 1830s is one of the most rebellious decades against slavery. There are revolts everywhere. Nat Turner in Virginia in 1831, the Mali Revolt in Brazil in 1835, the Amistad Rebellion in 1839. Meanwhile, the British are abolishing slavery in their New World colonies in the 1830s too. So this is a time of tremendous upheaval, and slave owners are extremely nervous. They're very, very nervous. And David Walker's pamphlet puts a thumb on a nerve. So this is going to be a very rebellious time. And I might add, at this time in the 1830s, running away to freedom acquires a whole new political meaning because it's part of a context of this whole wave of resistance. Okay. So I'm studying in my book 5 southern ports. I've already mentioned Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina, Norfolk, Virginia, Baltimore, Maryland. Thank you for cleaning up after your clumsy speaker. And then I'm studying 4 ports in the north to which people escaped: Philadelphia, New York, New Bedford, Massachusetts, a small town, but a whaling town, sent a lot of these ships into the Pacific, and also Boston. So these are the nine cities that are involved. You know, one way to think about this, it's one of the earliest migrant solidarity movements. One of the first situations in which people wanted to help migrants gain their freedom. So we can come back to that point if you like. So that's the global/Atlantic context. Now there's a local context. If we could have the next slide. This is the port, the Hudson River port of New York City in the U.S. in the 1860s, let's say. I don't have to tell people from Chile that the waterfront is a rough place, a dangerous place, where desperate people come and go with the tides. But I'm sure I don't have to tell you this either. The docks, the waterfront, are an absolutely crucial part of a global system of capitalism. They are the most strategic location for the movement of commodities. People in the hinterlands around all of these ports, whether it's New York or Valparaiso, produce commodities that are then taken to the port, loaded on the ships, and then taken somewhere else. This is the way all port cities operate. In the case of America, as I've said, it was tobacco, rice, and cotton. And all of these commodities are moved by a group that I call the motley crew. What's the Spanish for that?
Tripulación variopinta.
Variopinta. You got it. That's the word. They're multi-ethnic. They're multiracial. They come from many different backgrounds, but their labor is absolutely crucial. The work they do on the waterfront is crucial to the functioning of the whole economic system. There are these global commodity chains, right? Economic historians pretend those commodities move themselves, but they don't. Human labor is always involved, and these workers, this motley crew, the workers on the waterfront, are central to the operation of this world market. Now, if escape is the project from below, what is the project from above? What are the merchants and industrialists and slave owners trying to do in these port cities? Well, they're trying to control them. They're trying to police them. They've got the watch, the guard, the police, security forces of all kinds, trying to prevent smuggling, trying to prevent escape, trying to prevent pilferage on the docks, a very common thing. Look at this image and tell me how easy it would be to control that. This is a kind of a vast anarchic space with all kinds of different work going on. It's really hard to control. And the the southern rulers especially, are doing everything they can to control it. So this is a place where the forces of slavery and the forces of anti-slavery collide. Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about the agents. Who are the agents, the historical agents? Who are the players in this system of maritime escape? The first player is the fugitive himself or herself. And frequently it's a group of people who go together. Okay? So really important to know that the first initiative is taken by the enslaved at great risk. If your runaway bid fails, you are going to pay for it by losing skin on your back. They say a pound of flesh. Almost all runaways were severely flogged and sometimes tortured in even worse ways. So the first important figure in this is the fugitive. Okay, next, the most important player is the sailor. If we could have the next slide, please. Okay, so this is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a man who escaped slavery in Baltimore in 1838. He went on to become the most important abolitionist in the entire Atlantic world in the 19th century. He was a powerhouse of an orator. He was an unbelievably gifted writer. He wrote the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass in 1845, 7 years after he escaped, a scathing indictment of slavery. He was a man of the waterfront. And what you see right here is him dressed as a sailor escaping slavery in Maryland. Now, Frederick Douglass worked in a place called Fells Point. This was the waterfront of Baltimore. He was a caulker. Do you know the word for this in Spanish? He would line the seams of the planks of the ship to keep the ship from leaking. Very important job in a world where all ships are wooden, okay? So he basically worked all along this waterfront. One day he met two Irish sailors. He was about 12 years old. Met two Irish sailors, and he helped them unload a small vessel. They didn't ask him to, but he just walked up and pitched in and helped them unload. And after it was all over, they said, "Little boy, are you a slave?" He said, "Yes." They asked, "Are you going to be a slave for your entire life?" He said, "Yes." And then they said, "You could be free. You could get on a ship and go to New York where you could be free." Now, he was too young to undertake this, but he wrote in his autobiography, "I never forgot that meeting in which these people told me I could be free. And from that moment on, I was determined that one day I would be free." He became free. He became an abolitionist of the most extraordinary power. And if any of you ever want to read a book about American slavery, I urge you to read the narrative of Frederick Douglass. It's a powerful account. Okay, so the sailor is a key player. The next slide, please. Dock workers. And this is an image of 5 dock workers from Charleston, South Carolina, drawn by a British artist in, I think it was 1853. So these dock workers are responsible for what goes on the ships and what goes off the ships. They carry everything. They are in a strategic position. They can stow the bales of cotton with a small opening for someone to hide in. Now, I don't know what exactly is going on. These are called wharf hands. But this man is quoted as saying, "I be on the deck the whole time, I didn't see nothing." It's almost like somebody was asking him about a runaway. And he said, "I was here the whole time and I didn't see anything." Solidarity between the dock worker and the fugitive. Okay, so that's another group. Next slide, please. Now here's an image of a market woman. All of the ports had women who would go on the ships or on the docks, and they would sell fresh produce. You can see she's got carrots, she's got lettuce. Sometimes they would have other items they would sell. Sailors were arriving. They had money in their pockets, and they were frequently hungry because the food on ships wasn't very good. A Boston abolitionist described a woman like this. This woman is from Baltimore. This painting from 1858, there's an image of the waterfront of Baltimore, same place Frederick Douglass escaped from. An abolitionist in Boston said, "A colored woman would go on board every ship in Boston and ask the sailors if there were any runaways on board. And if she found out that there was, she would come back and tell the abolitionists, and they would send a small vessel of people to liberate that person in the middle of the night." So these market women are also abolitionists, very crucial to this network. Other players in this, there are artisans, there are day laborers, there are cartmen who carry the commodities, draymen who have horses with sleds behind them, and prostitutes. This is the motley crew. They're all part of the motley crew. They are multi-ethnic, they are international, and they are cosmopolitan because they have been all over the world. Cosmopolitan. We'll come back to that. Okay, now, think about all this policing, right? Everything that can be done to keep enslaved people off these ships, at least the ones who don't work there, all that's being done. But there were countervailing forces that were helping people to get on board those ships. For example, many captains arrived in a southern port and they needed labor. Sailors got sick. Sailors ran away. They jumped ship. So that captain might hire a runaway with no questions asked. Okay, shh, come on board. Secondly, quite a lot of enslaved people worked on the waterfront and had maritime skills. Some of them were boatmen. Some of them sailed tall ships. So they had skills. So it's not just you're taking me on board, I can help you. I know how to sail a ship. Right? So that's a second countervailing force. Third, by the 1850s, a number of northern ship captains were committed abolitionists. So they would actually go to the southern ports with the intention of bringing enslaved people out. Now, this was a really dangerous thing to do. And several of these ship captains got caught. They went to prison for many years for doing this. So it's a really dangerous thing to do, but they're absolutely crucial to all this. And then finally, the free black communities. There are free black communities in the southern ports and free black communities in the northern ports, and they're the main ones who provide assistance. They'll hide you in the south until you can find a proper ship. They'll help you in the north get away on board another ship to go to a safe place. Okay, so these are some of the countervailing forces. Now, here is the main theoretical point of what I'm saying right here. The cooperation among workers on the waterfront is created by capital. Right? Capitalists organize the work of moving the ships and moving the commodities, moving the cargo. But once those workers are organized into cooperative labor relationships, they can undertake projects of their own. They don't have to do only the things that the merchants want them to do, and this is how to understand this system of escape. The organized labor that is part of this system of capitalism is subverted. That's the word, subverted, by the workers on the waterfront and the enslaved to accomplish something very different. Not make money for the merchants, but create freedom for the oppressed. Okay, so I want to give you now an example of how this system actually worked. I want to give you a specific example. The year is 1847, and a Brazilian ship arrives in New York. It comes to the East River on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and a group of black dock workers go on board the ship to unload bags of coffee. Okay? We can have the next slide. When they go on board the ship, they discover there are 3 enslaved people, 2 men and 1 woman. So what do the black dock workers do? They go to the colored sailors' boarding home, place where black sailors stay when they're in New York. It's only 2 blocks from Roosevelt Wharf, where the ship docked. So they go to see a man named William P. Powell. He was the proprietor of the sailors' home. It was a place where there was a lot of knowledge about slavery. Black sailors stayed there. They brought back stories from the South. But it was also a place where he would take in runaways and help them on their way to freedom. So I want to tell you, this is a story about William P. Powell and the colored sailors' boarding home. I might add that Powell is almost completely unknown, although a really crucial figure. He didn't write any books. He didn't leave any papers for historians to study, but it turns out he was a vigorous correspondent in abolitionist newspapers. And this wonder called the keyword search engine allowed me to find about 200 articles he wrote. So I try to reconstruct his life in the book. Okay, so the ship docks on Roosevelt Street, the end of the East River. Next slide. This is really what it looked like. You see almost like a forest of masts, people working along the waterfront. So these dock workers go to William Powell to tell him about these 3 enslaved people. And Powell does something unbelievably clever. He changes his clothes into what a merchant would look like. He disguises himself, right? And he goes down the street. It's just 2 blocks away. He goes down the street and he boards the ship where the 3 enslaved people are. Slavery's been abolished in New York, by the way. So any enslaved person who comes into New York is automatically free. But he walks around the ship pretending to be the merchant who was receiving the coffee. And he looks at this and he looks at that and just acts like he owns the place. And then he sees one of these enslaved men walking on near the rails. And he goes up to him and he says to him in Portuguese, "Are you a slave?" And the man said, "Yes." And William Powell said, "You won't be a slave for long." And didn't I tell you the motley crew was cosmopolitan? William Powell had sailed to Brazil, spent some time in Brazil. He knew Portuguese. And it's a good thing, too, because the man he talked to only knew 1 word of English. Now, his name was Mahama Bakwakwa. And owing to one of the great accidents of this story, we can reconstruct what happened from the point of view of William Powell and from the point of view of the enslaved man he was talking to. Okay? Bakwawa also knew that slavery had been abolished in New York, and he was already planning to run away, but he only knew one word of English, which had been taught to him by an English sailor on the voyage, and that word was F-R-E-E, free. So when he jumped ship, the one word he'd say to people was, free, 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 help me to be free, right? But he didn't need to do that because William Powell found him. Well, now a big group of people are gathering around this ship, mostly black waterfront workers, but some abolitionists, black and white, and they're mulling over an armed rescue. This is actually very common in this day. They would literally go aboard the ship with guns to take fugitives away. Before they could do that, though, Powell went to another African-American man who had the great name Louis Napoleon. And he was an expert at getting judges to give a document called a writ of habeas corpus to free someone who was illegally being detained in prison or in slavery or whatever it may be. So inside of very little time, the three enslaved people were standing before a court, a judge in New York. Now, for reasons that we don't fully know, the woman decided to go back to the ship. Maybe she was pressured. Maybe she had family in Brazil. We don't know. But she decided to go back. The two men refused, so they were put into jail in New York, Eldridge Street Jail. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about the man who was one of the two men who was being freed. His name was Muhammad Bakwawa. And if we could have the next slide, please. It turns out that in 1854, 7 years after he was freed, he wrote a memoir of his life. It's kind of a spiritual autobiography about his conversion to Christianity. It turns out he was from a city called Jogu in Benin, what is now Benin. He had been captured in the slave wars, shipped to Ouida in the kingdom of Dahomey, took the Middle Passage to Pernambuco, Brazil, then to Rio, where the owner of the ship purchased him. And then he was shipped out on board this vessel going to New York. Okay, so that's his point. That's who he was. Let's go back to the jail, okay? The two Brazilian men, or two African men, are in jail. And the next morning, they're missing. They're gone. The whole city of New York erupts in this buzz. What happened? Where did they go? Some people said, it must be a miracle. It wasn't a miracle. It was the careful, precise working of an abolitionist movement. Because as it happened, a white abolitionist had been arrested for debt and was in the same jail. So it was communicated to him that he had to help these two men escape. So what did he do? He took a big bottle of brandy to the jail guard's office and drank the man into a stupor. He lifts the keys. He opens the cell. The men come out. He opens the main door to the jail. The men go out and into a carriage which is waiting for them with William P. Powell so they can go off to Boston. And once they're in Boston, they're put on a ship to Haiti, which is a free black republic, far beyond the reach of the law of American slavers. So Bakwawa, it's kind of fascinating to know, when he wrote this, he still didn't have any idea about what had actually happened. He didn't understand it. And the way he explained his escape was that he thought it was the providence of God who had raised up friends for him in a strange land. Well, it may have been a strange land, and maybe it was that they were friends. William Powell used to call himself the friend of the slave. But this is the way the system worked. So just to recount, the system of maritime escape involved sailors, dock workers, abolitionist workers, a motley crew of sailors who connected ships and waterfronts and freedom struggles over thousands of nautical miles from Brazil to New York to Boston to Haiti, and eventually Makwakwa will go on to Great Britain and to Canada. So this is the way the maritime system actually works. Okay, so to conclude, if we could have the next slide, please. Why are these people who escape by sea so largely unknown? Now, there are a couple of obvious reasons. One is that escaping slavery was a major crime. So you tried to do it without any documentation. The perfect escape was one in which there was no documentation, right? But that doesn't explain why we don't know the maritime escapees, because the same was true for those who escaped by land. And then there's a second issue. Most historians do not study maritime sources. So that's an issue. People didn't know where to look to find out about these maritime escapes. So that's part of the answer, but that's not the whole answer. A third factor is that this metaphor, the Underground Railroad, it's a metaphor, right? It organizes our understanding by comparison to a railroad. Very few people escaped by railroad. They call it the Underground Railroad. It wasn't underground. Nobody escaped underground. So this metaphor leads us in the wrong direction and keeps us from seeing, because a metaphor will occlude or make your vision, make certain things disappear from your field of vision. Okay, so that's a third thing. But the fourth thing, and this is something we talked about yesterday, there is in our thinking, and I think this is worldwide, there is a bias of thought. I've made up a word to describe it, terracentrism, meaning that we all think that history happens only on land, in nation states. And therefore the seas are just historical voids, places where history doesn't happen. And that's obviously false. Lots of important things happen at sea. Race formation, class formation, culture formation, all these things happen at sea. But this terracentrism keeps us from seeing the sea as a site of struggle, a site of conflict, in this case over slavery. So I think that's the main reason. And then the final question I want to try to answer is, why does this matter? Why is it important? Well, the first thing that's important is the sheer magnitude of it. I estimate that 15 to 20,000 people escaped slavery this way. Do you realize what a massive loss of investment that is for Southern slave owners? It's a huge, huge thing. And my argument is that with every escape, the institution of slavery is undermined a little bit more. Death by 1,000 cuts. So these people actually helped to cause the Civil War, which is going to break out in 1861. But the other thing, actually, a couple more things that are important about this, it helps us to rethink running away. Running away is almost always presented as an individual thing, as the heroic individual managing to escape. It's a social thing. It's a collective thing. You've got to work with other people. You've got to find sailors and dock workers and market women who are going to help you. Right? That's a different image of running away. It's a collective process. And I think that is really crucial. And by the way, I think that the reason why we think of it as individual is that partly due to white abolitionists, that when they told the stories of these runaways, they made them sound very individualistic and heroic. And they were heroic, but they weren't always individualistic. So that's a second thing. And then finally, I think the most important thing about this book is that it helps us to rethink the history of abolition. Now, the dominant story of abolition was that this was a gift of enlightened gentlemen, middle and upper class men who literally came out of the Enlightenment to spread the truth of humanity. William Wilberforce is a great example of this, right? But what that does is exclude our understanding of abolitionism from below. And that's what this book is really about. It's about the fugitives, the dockers, the sailors, the market women, the people who took action. And in taking action, caused the formation of new abolitionist groups to help them in the North. But they are the ones who have power and who have agency in this situation. It's really not only those gentlemen who did play a part. But without this constant resistance from below, what those gentlemen could have done would have been very, very limited. So, William Powell, a sailor abolitionist, and Muhammad Bakwakwa, a sailor fugitive, are agents of history. They help to make history. It's a powerful connection. The movement towards civil war is in a very significant way caused by these people who escaped slavery, but only with the help of other workers did they transgress and defy the borders and the policing of the southern slave state. So in this way, the motley crew made history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Muchas gracias a todos por haber escuchado. Tenemos algo así como 10 minutos, muy poco porque hay que volver la sala a las 2:30, para algunas preguntas. Ojalá que las preguntas sean breves, al callo, que traten, porque también para hacer la traducción y también porque tenemos muy poco tiempo, entonces para que alcancen a ver una o dos preguntas.
Gracias. Me gustó mucho la presentación. Hay un detalle sobre los libelos y sobre estos panfletos que implican otras redes con las imprentas. Entonces, quisiera saber qué papel podrían haber jugado estas imprentas, qué intereses tenían detrás de soportar, de entregar apoyo a la causa abolicionista y de las fugas.
Thank you for that question, which is a very important question. You need to know that in this period, printing was not yet a capitalist industry. So there were very many small printers who were committed to abolitionism. So it was not hard for abolitionists to get those stories published. David Walker, these were not hard things to do. But it's really crucial that the abolitionists published massive amounts of material. And they would send this to the South in as many ways as they could. We've already heard about David Walker. But the key is small printers in the northern cities who are sympathetic to abolition and who get the business of the abolitionist organizations. Now, there was danger in this. A printer in Illinois named Lovejoy was actually murdered by a pro-slavery mob. There's a lot of pro-slavery sentiment in the North, and one of the places they frequently choose to attack are the radical publishers. But I think this is a really good question for almost all places where social movements take place. In the English Revolution, there were small printers who published the work of the most extreme radicals, the levelers, the diggers, the seekers, and all the rest. Same is true in the American Civil War. Same is true of a lot of the labor movements. They find their own publishers, as Camilo knows. But yeah, it's a strategic part of the struggle to be able to publish and spread the word.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Alguien más quisiera? ¿No? Tengan confianza. Sí. Tomás.
Muchas gracias, profesor, por su presentación. Quería preguntarle primero si había utilizado literatura de viaje de agentes coloniales británicos o blancos en general para hacer la reconstrucción de las experiencias de la sociedad esclava. Y si la respuesta es sí, ¿cómo utilizó esa literatura de viaje para no reconstruir esa experiencia desde la visión colonial? Gracias.
Okay, I'm not sure I got the whole question. The question was about...
They are thinking about the travel diaries of the colonial functionaries, the colonial officials, the British and also white in a broad sense.
And
So if you use in your research that travel diaries of the officers of the British Empire
Okay.
and also white of the United States.
Okay. Yeah, this actually is a very big question because in writing history from below, you frequently have to rely on documents that are produced by oppressors. It's very common. So what you have to do is to read their documents with their class position in mind to understand how that would distort everything that they're saying, but also it's very frequently the case that useful information about those down below will be in those documents. I'll give you an example. One of the chapters of a book I wrote called The Many-Headed Hydra is based on a set of legal records about an uprising in New York City in 1741, compiled by a judge. The judge included all kinds of things in these documents that he didn't understand, like the oaths that the conspirators were taking among themselves. Some of them were West African, some of them were Irish. He had no idea what those were, but they ended up in the document. So you can come along and find those things and then link them to other kinds of evidence and thereby paint a picture. So the history of slavery has to be written with upper class sources, not all of the time, but you always have to take those with great skepticism. But it is also true that abolitionists would sometimes, in the case of runaways, publish their life stories in their own voice. Like Frederick Douglass wrote his own, but other people couldn't write, so they would dictate the story to an abolitionist who would write it down. Now, you've got to be careful about how the abolitionist is reinterpreting that person's experience. But nonetheless, you can basically tell, if you immerse yourself in all of the other kinds of sources, you can tell what's truthful in that document and what is ideological distortion. So it's all about learning to read documents so as to do history from below. And that it's an art, and it's a craft, and it's something that you have to study. And I've spent 50 years studying it. So by the time I got to this project, I had a pretty good idea how to do it. Thank you.
Bueno, hasta ahí nomás podemos. Tenemos que volver a la sala. Dos cosas, chiquillos, gente, antes que se vaya. We have to thank you very much.
Wait, don't leave yet because someone wants to take a picture of me with the students.
Esa era la segunda cosa. La primera era que pueden ahora a la salida, estamos vendiendo los libros que editamos en español. El profesor va a estar gustoso de firmarlo. You are very glad to see, yeah. So, y lo segundo era que necesitamos una foto con el profesor y el público y todo eso, así que si nos pueden ayudar un momento con eso. Muchas gracias por haber venido y muchas gracias de nuevo a Marcus.